My ex-wife and her lawyer lover took everything in the divorce. The house, the business, $6.70 million, even our kids. Sue me, she laughed. I'm untouchable. I thought I had lost it all, but then I discovered something buried since 1960 that no one ever expected. The teller went pale. It had been earning compound interest silently, while they laughed at my fall, until history struck back. Before I tell you how this turned out, if you're listening, tap like and comment where you're hearing this from. Sometimes sharing it, even quietly, makes the weight a little lighter. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? My name is Surya, and I'm in my late 30s. For most of my life, I've been underestimated, erased, and told my patience was weakness. I sat there, across from them, and watched her smirk as if she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The lawyer leaned back, casual, arrogant, and she let him do the talking, like I was some sideshow attraction rather than the man who built everything from the ground up. You're broke. And powerless, she said, letting the words hang in the air, sharp and deliberate. My hands rested on my knees, still, fists clenched under my thighs. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence itself was my roar, but she didn't hear it. She couldn't. Not when she was so sure of her victory. I remember the exact moment I realized it was all gone. The house, the business, our savings, the $6.7 million vanished like it never existed, funneled into her new life and his smug satisfaction. They didn't just take money, they took the very proof that I had been enough. My mind raced, calculating, reeling, trying to find a way back from a cliff I hadn't even seen coming. Every laugh from her felt like a hammer striking the foundation of who I thought I was. I pictured the office I had spent years building, the contracts I had negotiated at 2 a.m., the deals that had required every ounce of my focus and pride. All of it handed over to someone who didn't earn a single drop of it. Sue me, she said, her voice soft, confident, almost taunting. I wanted to spit. I wanted to stand up and scream, but something in me stopped. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. A slow-burning, simmering fire that refused to be extinguished by theatrics. Her lawyer leaned forward, like he was offering comfort. It's all legal. You have no recourse. The words were meant to humiliate, to underline my helplessness. I didn't respond. I simply listened, heart pounding, mind racing, body still. Silence became my shield. The world was loud around me, the air thick with the scent of cheap cologne and success that didn't belong to me, yet I held on to quiet. Later, sitting in my car outside their office, I let my hands fall to the steering wheel and closed my eyes. Anger came first, sharp and biting. But underneath it was a deeper, slower ache. A sense of erasure, of being made invisible not by accident but by design. I thought about every small victory I had claimed, every proud moment of building a life, and how easily it had been dismantled. But in that ache, a thought crept in, almost unnoticed. Maybe this was not the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something quieter, more precise. I drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights blurring past like memories I couldn't touch. My reflection in the rearview mirror stared back at me, tired eyes, tight jaw, fists still clenched. Every instinct screamed for retaliation, immediate, messy, loud. But another voice, softer, older, more grounded, whispered, patience. There's power in waiting. There's power in letting history catch up. I went home to an apartment stripped bare by necessity and lawyers. Boxes lined the walls, empty shelves staring back. The silence was oppressive, yet familiar. It was the same silence I had cultivated in boardrooms, in negotiations, in moments when the world expected me to yell to be heard. Now, it wrapped around me like an old coat, uncomfortable but protective. I paced, hands in pockets, tracing the edges of empty counters, imagining the echo of footsteps that had once meant laughter, family, warmth. Gone. The phone vibrated once. A text from a former colleague, the one who had always believed in me, heard about everything. Sorry. I stared at it, unread, my chest tight. Pity was a trap. Sympathy was poison. They could offer neither, and I didn't want it anyway. I had to feel my own fury, my own loss, my own quiet determination. This wasn't a time for conversation. This was a time to feel, to process, to burn in the stillness before action. I remembered Grandpa's voice, faint but distinct, from years ago. Some things last longer than people. Money, pride, silence, they can outlive a man if he knows what to do with them. I had laughed then, foolishly, thinking it was just old wisdom. Now, the words felt like a map, faint but precise. Somewhere, buried under decades, was a thread I could follow. Not revenge in the messy, satisfying sense. Something quieter. Something inevitable. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, running scenarios in my head. Every option felt small. Every immediate strike would look desperate. And that's what they wanted me to do, act. Show weakness. Rage. Capitulate. I didn't. I stayed still. I breathed. I waited. By dawn, the city was quiet, the streets empty, and I finally exhaled. Not in relief, not in surrender, but in understanding. Everything they had taken was theirs to hold temporarily. The laughter, the smirk, the arrogance, they were brittle, fragile. And patience, as always, would be louder than any shout. I glanced at the stack of old papers I had found tucked away in a drawer. Faded, yellowed, almost invisible. Grandpa's old account. Opened in 1960. Untouched, accruing quietly while the world around it changed. The thought made my chest tighten, not in hope, not yet, but in recognition that something had survived. Something real. Something mine. I didn't know how it would all end. I didn't know when the moment would come. But I knew one thing. The joke wasn't on me, not yet. And the quietest power is the one that waits until the moment everyone else has forgotten it exists. And so, I waited. The morning after the confrontation, I woke to an apartment that felt smaller than the night before. Every wall, every empty shelf, whispered the losses I had already tallied. The house, stripped clean of any sign of my life. The business accounts, locked and drained, our shared savings, evaporated into their pockets. The silence in the space pressed down on me, heavy and unyielding, yet I felt the peculiar clarity that comes when you are stripped to nothing. There was nothing left to fight over in the immediate sense. Everything had been taken, and yet, in the emptiness, a spark of awareness flickered. I had survived. I moved methodically through the apartment, counting what remained, documents in folders, a laptop with a dead battery, a few personal items I had managed to keep hidden. The sheer ordinariness of what was left contrasted painfully with the luxury they flaunted. I could almost feel her laughter echoing through the empty rooms, mocking me for my stillness, for my inability to lash out, for the restraint I had chosen. And yet, I held on to it. The restraint was my lifeline, my proof that I still commanded the only power that mattered right now, patience. The phone buzzed again. Another friend, someone who had always seen me as competent and capable, sent a long, awkward message. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't reply. Pity was a trap, sympathy a distraction. The only words I could allow myself were the ones I held in the quiet chambers of my own mind. I let the messages sit unread. I had to feel the gravity of loss, let it anchor me, sharpen my focus. Only then could I start to think beyond the immediate humiliation. I remembered sitting at my desk at the old office, poring over spreadsheets late into the night, thinking about growth, expansion, the pride I took in every minor victory. Those victories were hollow now, or at least, they seemed to be. But in the hollowness, I recognized something crucial. The work, the diligence, the patience I had applied to my career and life, those things hadn't vanished. They existed within me, independent of what anyone else stole or destroyed. That understanding was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. It was the first ember of control I could still reach. I walked down to the kitchen to make coffee, the aroma filling the small space, grounding me in the simplest of rituals. As I waited for the water to boil, my mind wandered to the family gatherings I had once hosted. The laughter, the warmth, the unspoken hierarchy that I had always quietly navigated. How easily it had been overturned. How suddenly I was rendered invisible in every sphere I had once managed. But invisibility was a tool, I realized, one I could use deliberately. My silence, my patience, these were not weaknesses, they were weapons yet to be wielded. I spent hours going through the documents I had managed to salvage, reading and rereading the legal papers that detailed what had been taken. Each line, each clause, burned into my mind, but they also sharpened it. Every figure, every signature, every official stamp was a reminder of their audacity, but also of the procedural boundaries within which I could operate. I began to map out what could be leveraged, what could be observed, what could be noted for the day when patience became strategy. By midday, I felt a strange combination of exhaustion and focus. My body was tired from lack of sleep, but my mind was alert in a way it hadn't been in years. I could sense the arrogance of her world outside my walls, the careless confidence with which they flaunted what was never theirs to flaunt. I did not need to intervene yet. I only needed to watch, to understand, to prepare. The external world was loud, but I remained silent, internal, unshakable. In the evening, I ventured out to the local cafe where I used to meet colleagues and clients. Their glances, the subtle pity in their eyes, it was all noted. I took in the details, the way my absence was acknowledged, the way the office had been spoken of as hers now. But with each observation, I felt less like a victim and more like a silent observer in someone else's play. My role had shifted. I wasn't yet acting, but I was gathering intelligence, reading behavior, measuring confidence, tracking arrogance. Returning home, I found a quiet corner and sat with the few documents I had flagged earlier. Among them, a faint memory of something older, something from my grandfather's time, nudged at me. It was a paper I had seen only in passing before, almost insignificant at the time. Now it seemed to glow with potential. Not as an immediate solution, but as a seed. I had survived the first wave of loss. Now I was cataloging, preparing, learning the contours of the battlefield they thought they had created. Before sleep, I reflected on the day. The loss was total in the material sense, but emotionally, I had started to reclaim my ground. Restraint had become my ally, silence my strategy. The world may have laughed at me, may have celebrated my fall, but in the quiet aftermath, I realized that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it is subtle, patient, almost imperceptible. And sometimes, the most powerful moves are the ones that wait until the moment everyone else has forgotten the rules of the game. As I closed my eyes, I knew tomorrow would not be about reacting. It would be about observing, preparing, and counting losses not as failures, but as information. And somewhere in that strategy, hidden behind the surface of despair, the first flickers of a return, a plan that had nothing to do with vengeance in its common form, were beginning to take shape. I never imagined the extent to which humiliation could be performed as a spectacle until I ran into them at the industry gala. She floated through the room like she owned it, which, in a sense, she did now, and he trailed behind, smug, performing charm for anyone who would watch. I stayed on the periphery, unnoticed, observing. Every laugh they shared, every glance exchanged, felt like a blade scraping across my pride. And yet I remained still. Silent. The silence was deliberate. It was a shield forged in the fires of my recent losses. Walking into the room, I was acutely aware of the whispers. Colleagues who had once greeted me with respect now glanced away, unsure, uncomfortable. I felt the subtle shifts in demeanor, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Each micro-rejection, each passive humiliation, sank into my chest, but it didn't break me. Instead, it sharpened my focus. Observation became my armor. I cataloged every detail, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the slight smirk that never left him, the arrogance that filled the room as if I were invisible by design. They approached a group of people I had once considered friends, and I felt a pang, a mixture of anger and disbelief. The room buzzed with admiration for them, admiration that I once commanded. It should have stung, and it did, but I resisted the urge to react. I knew that any display of outrage would feed their narrative, validate their triumph. So I breathed, counted my pulses, and remained a silent observer. The power in restraint is subtle, but it is durable. At one point, She leaned in close to a colleague who had always been my confidant and whispered something that made the other person's eyes widen. I couldn't hear the words, but I understood the intention. To dominate the social landscape, to humiliate without confrontation, to assert her ascendancy. It would have been infuriating if it were not so methodical. And yet, even as my pulse quickened, I felt a strange calm. I realized I was studying the architecture of arrogance. Every smirk, every sideways glance, every laughter designed to wound or boast was a blueprint for their weaknesses, for the cracks that would eventually reveal themselves. Later, near the buffet, he caught my eye for a fraction of a second. A flash of recognition? Perhaps. But it was fleeting, swallowed immediately by his own performance. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The gaze lingered in my mind far longer than it did in reality, a reminder of what had been taken and what I was quietly observing, waiting for the right time to reclaim. Every humiliation was a data point. Every subtle slight a note in the ledger I was compiling in my mind. I remembered how once, in the boardroom, I had learned to read people the same way. Subtle gestures, a twitch of an eyebrow, a pause in speech. Now, the same lessons applied outside the walls of commerce, in the theater of social dominance. I understood that humiliation was both a weapon and a mask. And masks can slip. All I had to do was wait for them to reveal themselves, for arrogance to falter under its own weight. In the car afterward, I exhaled slowly. The night had been a performance, but I had survived it intact. The simmering fury inside me was tempered now by clarity. Every detail I had observed was a thread to be pulled, a weakness to exploit, a moment to leverage in silence. I felt a strange satisfaction, almost imperceptible, in recognizing that my absence, my quiet observation, had not rendered me powerless. It had made me strategic. At home, I spread out my notes, mentally cross-referencing behaviors with prior knowledge. The way she moved, the way he spoke, the confidence they exuded, it all had patterns. Patterns have predictability. And predictability can be countered, calculated against. I began sketching scenarios, mapping out the social and professional battlefield they had assumed was theirs by default. My losses were visible to all, but my strategy remained invisible. I thought about the small victories I could reclaim without confrontation. Patience, restraint, and subtle leverage. I revisited the thought of my grandfather's old account, tucked away decades ago, accumulating quietly while the world turned. I hadn't acted yet, but the idea lingered, persistent, a quiet promise of reversal without spectacle. My attention to detail, my deliberate silence, these would be the tools to reclaim what had been taken. Before sleep, I let my mind drift through the evening's interactions once more. Every slight, every smile, every whisper had been catalogued. Humiliation had been performed as theater, and I had been cast as the silent audience. But I realized the irony. The audience often remembers the quiet observer more vividly than the actors on stage. The power isn't always in the performance, it's in the preparation, the patient understanding of others' weaknesses. And tomorrow, the observation continues. The humiliation tour is not over, but neither is my strategy. The loudest power, I had learned, is the one that waits silently for the right moment to act. By the time I reached my apartment that evening, the world outside seemed louder than usual, almost cruelly vibrant. Streetlights flickered on, car engines hummed, laughter echoed from distant restaurants. All of it a reminder that life moved forward even as mine had been paused, dissected, and displayed like some cautionary tale. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, feeling a fatigue that wasn't just physical but bone deep, the kind that settles into your chest when humiliation becomes routine. I couldn't show it, not to anyone, and certainly not to them. Vulnerability was a liability they would exploit without hesitation. I had learned that lesson the hard way. And yet, inside, something was fraying. Anger twisted into self-doubt. The quiet patience I had cultivated began to tremble. I wanted to scream, to hit back, to dismantle their arrogance with a single word or gesture. But the voice inside, the one tempered by loss and observation, urged me to breathe, to catalog, to wait. Restraint had become my only form of armor. I sank onto the couch and closed my eyes, replaying the evening over and over. Each interaction, each subtle jab, each whispered laugh carried weight I couldn't immediately quantify. How many times had she smiled at him in front of others as if they were conspiring against me? How many had noticed the way they flaunted the life I once built? My mind tracked every micro-expression, every pause, every glance. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was surgical, designed to dissect my confidence and leave me exposed. And they were meticulous. A text lit up my phone. "My sister, you okay?" I stared at the words, and for a long moment, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I couldn't answer with truth. I couldn't write, "No, they've destroyed everything and I feel invisible." That would betray the only power I still held, the ability to wait, observe, and strike strategically. I left the message unread. Even silence could be a statement, a subtle assertion of control. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the only constants in this apartment now. I sat cross-legged on the floor, documents spread before me. Legal papers, bank statements, letters, they all demanded analysis. I began cross-referencing, noticing inconsistencies, procedural gaps, anything that could be leveraged later. My hands shook slightly, betraying the internal chaos I refused to voice. The breakdown was happening inside, but externally, I remained composed, calculating. I thought back to my grandfather's words, "Some things outlive people, Surya. Patience, silence, even money. Learn to respect what lasts." I understood then that my grandfather's wisdom wasn't about immediate gains. It was about endurance, observation, and the quiet accumulation of advantage. I realized that the emotional turmoil I felt wasn't weakness, it was preparation. Every pang of doubt, every surge of rage, every flicker of pain was a tool, a calibration for the actions yet to come. Hours passed. I pored over every detail from the previous days, connecting interactions, noting patterns, predicting behavior. It was exhausting work, mentally grueling, but necessary. I had been knocked to my knees publicly, but on the floor of that apartment, amidst the scattered papers and the silence, I was gathering strength in a form they could never anticipate. Knowledge, patience, and the observation of arrogance were more powerful than immediate retaliation. Late at night, I stared out the window at the city lights, my reflection merging with the darkness outside. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the loss fully. A single tear slipped, but I wiped it away quickly, determined that no one would ever witness my unraveling. My emotions were mine to harness, mine to contain, and mine to direct. The breakdown I couldn't show was transforming into quiet resolve. I revisited the old account once more, mentally tracing the history, the numbers, the compound interest that had accumulated since 1960. I imagined the teller's reaction, the disbelief, the tiny victory hidden in plain sight. It was a reminder that patience could manifest in ways far more powerful than immediate confrontation. The smallest details, left unnoticed by others, could become instruments of reversal. Finally, I prepared a list of observations from the evening, categorizing each interaction, each slight, each public performance of dominance. I realized that I was learning more from their arrogance than from any direct instruction. The more they flaunted their victory, the more I understood the fragility behind the performance. There was strategy in every smile, but there were cracks, too, and I intended to find them. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I acknowledged the truth. My emotional fracture was hidden, but it existed. It was raw, consuming, and intimate. Yet, I had chosen it intentionally, using it as a foundation rather than a weakness. Tomorrow would bring another day of observation, another day of quiet calculation. My humiliation had been orchestrated, but my response was deliberate, silent, and growing in power. I couldn't yet strike, but I could prepare. And in that preparation, I was already reclaiming a measure of control they could never take from me. I spent the morning in silence, the apartment heavy with the weight of observation. The city outside moved at its relentless pace, but I felt suspended, caught in a liminal space between loss and strategy. My ex-wife and her lawyer lover had constructed an empire out of what had been mine, yet every interaction, every boast, every superficial smile carried within it the seeds of fragility. I watched it all unfold like an intricate machine, meticulously maintained yet fundamentally flawed. I logged into the accounts I still controlled, tracing every transfer, every asset, every minor discrepancy they had overlooked. It was tedious, almost monotonous work, but in monotony lies clarity. Patterns emerged, small errors, overlooked clauses, slight miscalculations. The arrogance that had once overwhelmed me now became the blueprint for my quiet reclamation. Each mistake was a fissure in their confidence, waiting for the right pressure to exploit. By midday, I ventured out, keeping my presence low profile. Coffee in hand, I observed their social circle, noticing how people responded to them now. Some colleagues smiled too brightly, others avoided eye contact, and a few even whispered when they thought no one was listening. Humiliation had its theater, but the stage was unstable. Arrogance had made them predictable. And predictability, I realized, was leverage. I returned home, documents spread across the kitchen table. The numbers, the schedules, the public appearances, all interconnected. The more I studied, the clearer the weaknesses became. My heart pounded not in panic, but in measured anticipation. I felt the slow, deliberate tightening of control that comes from understanding, from insight. I knew that retaliation in haste would be visible, noisy, and ultimately ineffective. But quiet accumulation of knowledge was subtle, almost invisible, and infinitely more powerful. Later, I revisited conversations I had overheard, every subtle jab, every veiled insult catalogued mentally. I mapped them onto the framework of their social and financial actions. Every boast and laugh was a clue, every show of dominance an unintended confession of vulnerability. By evening, the patterns were undeniable. Their empire, while gleaming and confident, was inherently brittle, built on misjudgments and arrogance. I didn't need to confront them yet, the cracks would widen on their own. My job was to wait, observe, and prepare to act when timing became absolute. A late text from a former business partner landed on my phone. "Are you sure you're okay?" "They've taken everything." I didn't respond. Pity and sympathy were tools they used to manipulate perception. I had no room for sentiment. Instead, I focused on the ledger before me, connecting lines of influence, tracking missteps, plotting mental paths that could be followed later. I realized that in the shadows of their confidence, a quiet power was growing inside me, patient, deliberate, and unnoticed. As night fell, I turned my attention to the old account, that quiet monument from my grandfather. The compound interest, accrued over decades, was more than numbers. It was a symbol. A reminder that the smallest, quietest actions can create immense impact over time. They had laughed at me, dismissed my patience as weakness, but what they failed to see was that silent, meticulous growth often outlasts boisterous displays of power. I began imagining how subtle leverage could transform that patience into action, how the overlooked account could shift the balance in ways they never anticipated. I spent hours constructing scenarios, mentally rehearsing outcomes, considering responses, and calculating timing. The humiliation they had orchestrated became a map rather than a wound. Each slight, each social maneuver, each flaunted victory was a reference point in the strategy one was building. I wasn't reacting impulsively, I was accumulating insight, gathering control in the invisible spaces they ignored. Before sleep, I reviewed the day's observations one last time. Every move they made had been noted, every misstep catalogued, every opportunity identified. The day had been long, mentally exhausting, yet oddly empowering. The empire they had built on my downfall was showing cracks, and I knew that the quiet patience, the careful analysis, and the unseen strength within me would eventually find a point of leverage. It wasn't about immediate satisfaction. It was about inevitability. And so I rested, knowing tomorrow would bring more observation, more insight, and more subtle reclamation. Their arrogance would continue to expose them, and I would be ready. The empire they flaunted would crumble, not by my shout or my fury, but by the quiet, deliberate patience I had cultivated. They believed the game was theirs. I was merely waiting for the right moment to turn the pieces against them. I woke that morning with a strange clarity. The kind that feels heavier than confusion yet lighter than relief. For weeks, I had moved through life in suspended observation, cataloging every detail, noting every arrogance-laden gesture, every whisper that belittled me. But now, a realization crystallized. My power had always been with me, waiting quietly beneath the rubble of losses and humiliation. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be immediate. It only needed to exist long enough for me to wield it with precision. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching the city stir to life. The office buildings gleamed in the morning sun, oblivious to the subtle warfare I was preparing. My ex-wife and her lawyer lover were out there, performing their victories, flaunting what they believed was untouchable. And they were vulnerable in ways they didn't yet understand. Patience, my grandfather had reminded me, outlasts arrogance. And patience had been my constant companion. I returned to the ledger of documents, spreading them across the table. I traced lines of transactions, cross-referenced assets, and mentally plotted scenarios that would allow the overlooked account to intersect with their assumed impunity. Every number, every date, every procedural note was a potential lever. I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was preparing for a revelation, a moment where silence and patience would overturn their world without chaos, without spectacle. By afternoon, I felt a shift in myself. The anger, the humiliation, the quiet despair, they were no longer weights pressing me down. They had become instruments, sharpened by awareness, honed into strategy. I realized that the world outside, with all its social judgment and superficial victories, had no hold on the internal clarity I now possessed. I could watch, wait, and act, not impulsively, but with inevitability. I allowed myself a rare smile, subtle, fleeting, knowing. This was not a moment of vengeance, it was a moment of acknowledgement. I understood the trajectory now. The cracks in their constructed world were visible, and my role was not to confront blindly but to position myself where their arrogance would do the work for me. Every miscalculation they had made was now a tool in my hands, waiting for the right alignment of events. Late in the day, I revisited the account one more time, tracing the compound interest, imagining the teller's reaction, picturing the disbelief on faces that had mocked me. The numbers weren't just figures, they were history speaking, proof that patience accumulates in ways arrogance can never anticipate. A quiet thrill ran through me, not of triumph yet, but of understanding the magnitude of what I had quietly nurtured while they laughed at my absence. The turning point came subtly. I noticed an inconsistency in one of the transfers, something minor, easily overlooked but sufficient to create an opening. It was a crack, almost invisible to anyone else, yet glaring in its potential. In that moment, I realized that the moment of action had been brewing all along, not in dramatic gestures, not in loud confrontations, but in the patient accumulation of knowledge, of awareness, of quiet power. The reckoning didn't need spectacle. It needed precision. I closed my eyes and felt the calm settle over me, a deliberate control replacing the old chaos. The shame and humiliation that had once threatened to consume me were now raw material, shaping clarity and purpose. I felt the subtle tension of anticipation, not desperation. It was a refined energy, focused and intentional, ready to be applied when the moment demanded it. The internal storm had settled, leaving only observation and preparation. As night fell, I reviewed everything once more. Every interaction, every transaction, every micro-expression catalogued, every potential weakness mapped. The turning point wasn't a single event. It was the accumulation of all the prior days, all the restraint, all the silent learning. I understood now that the quietest man in the room can wield the loudest power, if he knows when and where to act. Before sleep, I allowed myself a final reflection. The reckoning wasn't just about reclaiming wealth or correcting humiliation, it was about reclaiming control over myself, over the narrative of my life. Patience had become more than a strategy. It had become proof of endurance, proof of unseen power. I wasn't acting yet, but I knew with certainty that the moment was approaching when preparation would become execution. And in that quiet recognition, I felt something rare, the first taste of unshakable confidence, born not of vengeance but of inevitability. The empire they built on my absence would soon meet its match, not through noise or fury, but through patient, deliberate action. The quiet reckoning had begun, and it would be unstoppable. The day arrived with an almost cinematic stillness, the kind that precedes moments you know will reshape everything. I walked into the bank, papers in hand, the old account from 1960 resting quietly at the center of my plan. Outside, the world buzzed with ignorance of what was about to unfold. Inside, my pulse was steady. My ex-wife and her lawyer lover were already present, unaware that the very foundation they had mocked was about to assert itself with silent authority. The teller recognized me immediately, her eyes widening in shock as she glanced at the documents. This wasn't a small sum. It was the compounded accumulation of decades, patiently accruing, untouched, invisible to the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very patience I had cultivated mirrored the patient growth of this account. While they had laughed, flaunted, and assumed my weakness, history had been quietly amassing a quiet, unassailable power. They entered the bank moments later, exuding confidence, ready to gloat, to mock, to assert control. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. My calm was my weapon. As they approached, I felt the weight of all the days, all the silent observation, all the strategic patience settle behind my eyes. They believed in spectacle. I believed in inevitability. Her smirk faltered the moment she saw the numbers on the teller's screen. The lawyer's jaw tightened. They both assumed an error, some mistake I couldn't possibly have discovered. But there it was, undeniable, formal, and irrefutable. The $6.7 million they had taken, the assets they had flaunted as theirs, now paled beside the accumulated power of something overlooked, something silent, something unstoppable. The teller cleared her throat, her voice quivering. "Sir, this account, it's..." Her words stumbled under the weight of reality. I didn't finish the sentence for her. The room seemed to contract, the silence almost unbearable, yet I remained composed. The energy I had held in restraint for weeks now radiated quietly but unmistakably. I did not need to shout, to argue, or to beg. The numbers spoke louder than any confrontation could. My ex-wife tried to recover, to inject her usual arrogance, to reclaim dominance with words meant to belittle. This can't be real," she stammered, as if disbelief alone could negate the evidence. The lawyer leaned forward, attempting to assert control, but even he faltered under the immovable certainty before them. I remained still, observing the subtle cracks forming in their facade. Every micro-expression, every hesitant glance, revealed their unraveling confidence. I spoke then quietly, deliberately. "It's real. And it's been here all along. The account has been compounding since 1960. Every dollar, every cent, untouched, growing quietly while everything else fell into chaos." My voice was calm, unshakable, the opposite of what they expected. There was no hysteria, no rage, only the clarity of inevitability. The room absorbed it, the silence pressing on them heavier than any shout could. Their laughter, once so triumphant, had vanished. The lawyer's arrogance drained slowly, replaced by disbelief. My ex-wife's smirk crumbled, replaced by pale shock. For weeks, they had assumed control, flaunting what they believed was untouchable. Now, they realized that in their dismissal of patience and silence, they had miscalculated the most powerful force of all. As the teller finalized the transaction, transferring control in accordance with my rightful claim, I felt an unspoken satisfaction, not in revenge, not in spectacle, but in precision. This was the culmination of restraint, of observation, of patient strategy. The humiliation they had imposed on me, the arrogance they had exhibited, all unraveled silently before the very history they had ignored. I turned to them, voice still measured. Every action has a consequence. And sometimes history has the final say. There was no gloating, no triumph in tone, only the quiet authority of inevitability. Their silence was deafening. The empire they had assumed was secure had been quietly corrected, their victories rendered hollow by decades of unseen accumulation. Walking away from the bank, I felt the weight of the world shift. Not because I had shouted louder or acted impulsively, but because patience, silence, and clarity had executed what impulsive confrontation never could. The city moved around me, indifferent to my quiet triumph, but inside, I knew the narrative had changed irrevocably. I had reclaimed what was mine, not with spectacle, but with inevitability, with the power of history catching up. The morning after the bank meeting, the world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had just occurred. But inside me, everything had shifted. I walked through my apartment, noting the familiar spaces with new perspective. The weight of humiliation, loss, and frustration had lifted, replaced by something heavier, yet steadier, understanding, clarity, and an earned sense of authority over my own life. I poured coffee, the aroma grounding me, a reminder of the ordinary rituals that had sustained me through days of tension and quiet planning. Each sip was deliberate, reflective. I realized that the world would never fully recognize the patience it takes to reclaim control, to assert power silently, without spectacle. But I didn't need validation. The knowledge that I had endured, observed, and acted precisely when necessary was enough. I thought about the empire they had flaunted, once so certain, now reduced in significance by the very patience they had underestimated. The smirks, the whispered conversations, the public domination, they were all dismantled not by fury, but by quiet strategy and deliberate observation. The lesson was clear: power is strongest when unseen, accumulation matters more than bravado, and history can be an ally when handled with care. Sitting at my desk, I reviewed the remaining documents, cross-checking assets and accounts. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were evidence of endurance, proof that consistency and patience often surpass immediate action. Every transaction they had attempted to claim as victory now existed alongside the compounded account, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Not a triumph of arrogance, but a satisfaction in the inevitable correction of imbalance. I reflected on the days of humiliation, the social performances, the whispered laughter, and the calculated displays of dominance. Those experiences, once painful, had become essential training in understanding human behavior, reading arrogance, and recognizing patterns of overconfidence. Each insult catalogued, each slight observed, had shaped the strategy that ultimately turned the tables. I had learned more about restraint, observation, and control than any immediate act of revenge could have taught. The quiet power I now possessed extended beyond financial reclamation. I understood that patience and observation could govern interactions, relationships, and influence in ways more enduring than confrontation. The lesson was internalized. Composure and clarity yield results where emotion and impulsivity fail. Silence had become a language, restraint a strategy, and awareness the instrument of action. I walked to the window, looking out over the city streets, watching life unfold with indifferent rhythm. There was no fanfare, no acknowledgement of the small, deliberate victories that had occurred behind the scenes. And yet, the absence of recognition mattered little. The narrative of my life had shifted irrevocably, silently, and with precision. I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone. The knowledge of my own endurance and strategic patience was sufficient. In the quiet afternoon light, I began planning next steps, not as an act of vengeance, but as a continuation of deliberate, patient life management. Observing, anticipating, acting only when necessary, this would govern my approach going forward. The lessons of loss, humiliation, and careful reclamation were now embedded in my decision-making. Each day could be approached with foresight rather than reaction, with awareness rather than emotional impulsivity. As evening approached, I sat back, feeling the rare sense of equilibrium that comes only after conflict is quietly resolved. The experience had transformed me, not through dramatic confrontation or public spectacle, but through disciplined patience, internal reflection, and strategic observation. Silence, I realized, had been my greatest ally all along, and with it, I had reclaimed not just what was lost, but the authority over my own presence, choices, and future. And as night settled over the city, I allowed myself to rest in the certainty that power, when cultivated quietly and applied with patience, is enduring. The humiliations and losses that once threatened to define me now existed only as lessons and tools. Silence had become power, patience had become influence, and clarity had become freedom. I had reclaimed my life, not loudly, not impulsively, but inevitably, with the quiet assurance that comes from understanding the long game.